Ladies and gentlemen, you know that Magnus Carlsen is one of the greatest chess players of all time and the best endgame player to ever exist. He was the world champion from 2013 to 2023, almost 10 years, and is the number one ranked chess player since July 2011 with a peak rating of 2882, the highest in chess history. He was also a really good sportsman, so even after he lost, he wouldn't rage bait and he would always reset his pieces. However, during the Norway Chess Championship 2025 against the 2024 world champion Gukesh D from India, he was completely winning, but one terrible blunder on move 52 ruined everything. And he slammed the table, resigned, and stormed off from the playing hall without resetting his pieces, unable to believe what he had just done. This can be a lesson to all of you chess players. Do not rage on a loss. It will lead to your tilt in whatever tournament you are playing or your elo on chess.com, Lichess, or any other such platform. In the game, Gukesh had the white pieces and he started with e4, and Magnus with the black pieces responded with e5. After knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, d3, and bishop c5, the game turned into the Ruy Lopez Berlin defense. Magnus was very familiar with most variations of the Ruy Lopez, so he felt pretty confident about his chances. Gukesh continued with c3, which seems like just a normal waiting move, but it stabilizes the center, supporting the eventual d4. It also takes away the d4 and b4 squares from Magnus's knight on c6 and creates a strong pawn structure of c3, d3, e4, making it hard for Magnus to attack that structure. Now, Magnus and Gukesh both castle kingside. Magnus plays d6, further strengthening the pawn on e5 and creating a pawn chain of c7, d6, e5. Gukesh plays h3, preventing bishop g4, which would pin his knight to his queen. Then Magnus plays a6, kicking away Gukesh's light squared bishop. After bishop a4, Magnus plays h6, also preventing Gukesh from pinning his knight to his queen via bishop g5. After rook e1, Magnus further pushes Gukesh's a4 bishop away from his territory. Gukesh responded with bishop c2. Average players would play bishop b3, but if played, can be met by knight a5. Bishop b3 also blocks queenside play by a4 and use of the b file. However, bishop c2 further supports the e4 pawn and gives Magnus a much harder time to attack the bishop again and aids for a future d4 break. It also aims at the b1 h7 diagonal, which can be dangerous in case the position opens as it stays well coordinated with the queen on d1 and rook on e1. Magnus plays bishop b6 and Gukesh plays knight bd2, which seems modest but is very purposeful as it reinforces the e4 pawn, prepares central expansion via d4, is a flexible recapture piece in case the center opens, connects the queen, rooks, and the c2 bishop, also opening options like knight c4 or f1 e3 d5 routes later, and keeps key squares like c4 and e4 under control, limiting Magnus's piece activity. Magnus now plays knight e7, planning to reroute it to g6. After a4 and rook b8, Gukesh finally strikes with d4, the best move. Magnus then rotates his knight to g6 and Gukesh plays knight f1. And after c5, knowing that the d4 pawn is adequately defended, Gukesh puts his knight on g3. Here, both players have both knights on the king side, preventing any checkmate threats in the future. Magnus finally does the first capture of the game with c takes d4 after 15 moves, and Gukesh recaptures with his c pawn. Then, Magnus trades off his b pawn for Gukesh's a pawn, which Gukesh recaptures with his bishop, controlling the a4 e8 diagonal, preventing Magnus from playing rook e8. Now, Magnus fianchettos his light squared bishop to b7. Gukesh locks the center with d5 and Magnus plays a5. Gukesh then plays bishop e3, trying to trade the dark squared bishops, but Magnus plays bishop c8, which may seem like wasting a move, but this move made it more flexible, saving it from center advances and letting it see the c8 h3 diagonal, which is extremely dangerous, also preventing tactical threats against it. Gukesh plays b3 and Magnus trades bishops. Gukesh takes with his rook. Then Magnus plays knight f4, a very strong move as his knight is now on an outpost. Now Gukesh plays an inaccuracy, bishop c6, giving Magnus a slight advantage. The reason why this is an inaccuracy is because it focuses on a superficial one move threat while ignoring the more pressing strategic and tactical issues in the center and on the king side. However, Magnus plays rook b4, which is a mistake, getting rid of his advantage. He should have sacrificed the bishop with bishop takes h3, as after takes, knight takes h3 check, king g2, knight f4 check, and king g1, Magnus could play knight g4, having two knights near Gukesh's king and dominating the king side. However, Gukesh played queen c2, missing the chance of knight d2 to completely remove Magnus's advantage. Magnus plays g6 and Gukesh plays king h1, a mistake. It is a mistake because then Magnus plays bishop a6, which after queen a2, that is another mistake because Gukesh completely overlooked the structural vulnerability of his central pawns and pieces, allowing Magnus to completely tear open the center and win decisive material. Magnus played bishop d3. Now, Magnus's advantage is much higher and he has four pieces attacking Gukesh's king, which is extremely dangerous. Gukesh responds with knight d2 and Magnus plays h5, initiating a devastating kingside attack that exploits Gukesh's cramped and poorly coordinated pieces. Gukesh takes the free a5 pawn and Magnus trades queens. Then Magnus plays h4, attacking Gukesh's knight. Now, Gukesh attempts to trade off Magnus's dangerous b4 rook, but Magnus calmly plays rook fb8, supporting his b4 rook and forming a battery. Gukesh played rook a2, and after king g7 by Magnus, Gukesh places his rook on the 7th rank, and after rook d4 by Magnus, Gukesh attacks Magnus's rook, which instead of moving, he decides to sacrifice by taking the knight on g3. If Gukesh here took the rook, Magnus would play g takes f2, threatening to make a queen, and after rook f3, Magnus makes a queen, which Gukesh takes, and Magnus recaptures, giving him a 2-point material lead and an insane 4.9 advantage. Fortunately, Gukesh didn't fall for the trap and instead recaptured the pawn. But here, Magnus Carlsen sacrificed the knight. Knight takes h3. Here, Gukesh captured the knight and Magnus took the e4 pawn with the bishop. But if Gukesh had taken the rook instead, then Magnus would recapture, attacking the rook, and once Gukesh would take the bishop on d3, Magnus would play knight f2 check, forking the king and rook. After king h2, rook d1, and g4, Magnus captured the free pawn on d5 with his bishop, and then Gukesh traded the bishops, which Magnus recaptured with his knight, attacking the rook. Then, after rook e2, knight f4, rook c2, king f6, h4, king e6, and knight g5 check, Magnus played king d5, which is another great move, advancing his king towards Gukesh's. Then Gukesh played rook a5 check, and Magnus simply moved his king to d4. And after rook a4 check, he played king d3, attacking Gukesh's rook. Then, after Gukesh moved his rook to f2, Magnus played f6, a mistake, which took away some of his advantage, but it didn't matter as after rook f3 check and king e2, Gukesh checked Magnus's king from the wrong square, rook a2 check. He should have gone rook e4 check instead, as from rook a2 perspective, Magnus blocked the check with his rook, which Gukesh had to take and did. Magnus recaptures. Gukesh plays knight e4 check, forking the king and two of Magnus's pawns. Magnus attacked Gukesh's rook with king e2, which Gukesh defended with king g3. Then Magnus played d5, attacking the knight. Gukesh captures the pawn on f6, and Magnus attempts to attack the knight with rook f8. Gukesh checks with rook f2 check, and after king e1, Gukesh attacks Magnus's rook with knight d7. But here, Magnus played a horrible and decisive blunder, knight e2 check. Up until now, Magnus was completely winning in the game, but now In the end game, where he usually shines, he made a miscalculation and was completely losing. He thought that he could promote his pawns once all the pieces had been cleared out, but the endgame was completely lost as after rook takes e2 check, Magnus took the rook and Gukesh took Magnus's rook. From here, things went south for Magnus as Gukesh played h5 once his knight was well rerouted towards Magnus's pawns, stopping promotion. Magnus was forced to take, and Gukesh's h pawn was a passed pawn. And after king f4, we got this reaction.
Oh my god!
This was Gukesh's first classical win against Magnus Carlsen, and neither could he believe it, nor could Magnus, who was so angry that he slammed the table, resigned, and stormed off from the playing hall in disbelief. However, despite this drama, Magnus still went on to win Norway Chess 2025. So yeah, don't let anger or extreme sadness overcome you. Just forget about the loss, once lesson learned, and move on. If you'd like me to analyze more games, please like and subscribe. And if you can, please send me one of your games or comment which game I should analyze next.